On behalf of everyone at Better Read Than Dead, we're so excited to see you on Zoom tonight to celebrate Mark Mordue's wonderful book, Boy on Fire, The Young Nick Cave. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded, so if you prefer not to be filmed, please turn off your camera settings. Before we begin proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. These will be different depending on where you're zooming in from. For me, it's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that Better Read Than Dead is built. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now to introduce our guests. Mark Mordue is an Australian writer, journalist and editor. He was co-winner of the 2014 Peter Blaisley Fellowship, which recognises an outstanding manuscript in the fields of biography, autobiography or life writing. His work has been published widely, including in Interview, Rolling Stone, Vogue, GQ, The Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald. Mark was the winner of a 1992 Human Rights Media Award and the 2010 Pascal Prize for Critical Writing. From 1992 to 1997, he was the founding editor of Australia's leading pop culture magazine, Australian Style. His poetry, fiction and essays and memoir work have appeared in literary journals such as Heat, Meanjin, Griffith Review and Overland in Australia. Mark will be appearing in conversation tonight with Michaela Kalowski. Michaela is a regular interview and moderator at Ideas and Writers' Festivals. Recent and highlight interviews include Trent Dalton, Margaret Atwood, David Mitchell, Holly Ringland and Richard Feidler. She co-hosts radio programs for the ABC Radio National and this year's curated Radio National's first ever on-air Writers' Festival, the Big Weekend of Books. Before we get started, please note there will be a Q&A session towards the end of tonight's event. You can type any questions you may have for Mark into the group chat and he'll answer them via video once the time comes. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Michaela to kick things off.
Thanks very much, Bron. Hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight in conversation with Mark Mordue. I do wish we were all together in the room, but it's great to see everyone's names and it feels a bit like we're all together in the room. As Bron said, we're going to have a good time for your questions at the end. So keep them in mind as you go along and pop them in the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. But I want to say, if you're a huge Nick Cave fan, this book is an absolute treat because you'll love its detail, its kind of time travel glimpses into the early life of Nick Cave, growing up in Wangaratta and then moving into Melbourne as a young man, all his friendships and musical collaborations and influences along the way. And if you're someone who just loves great music biographies, you'll love the book because it explores all the big questions about creativity. What is talent? How does fame operate and affect creative output? What makes someone, in this case Nick Cave, become an iconic performer, while others, maybe arguably more talented, don't rise? How do artists get made and make themselves? And how does talent make art? And how do we, music lovers and readers, feed into that process? So I wanted to start by asking Mark Mordue the big $64 million question, because this book, as brilliant as it is, it adds to the canon of writing about Nick Cave. So really, I wanted to ask you, why do you think we're so fascinated by him? What is it about him that keeps us wanting to read and learn more about him?
Gee, I don't know whether that question's easy or difficult. Look, clearly Nick's a major Australian artist. You just listed the fact that he's much more than just a rock and roll singer. He's had books of poetry. He's written scripts for films. He's done incredible film soundtracks. He's acted maybe not so well in films, even he'd admit that. I think he called himself like a piece of wood or something to that description. But he's just got such a vast repertoire and he's an incredible live performer. Perhaps that's where he's at his peak more than any other place, to the point of ritualistically powerful. So, when I started this project, I used to sort of joke with friends, hey, it's like if I was doing a biography of Patrick White, but with loads of sex, drugs, rock and roll, plus you've got to throw in London, Berlin, Sao Paulo and the rest of the world as well, which is kind of how it all kind of crumbled for me. It took me 10 years to write. And I began to kind of think what I was doing, because it was so vast, and zone it down into being a portrait of the artist as a young man and focus very much on the Australian aspect to it. But what that echoes with is and echoes through all of Nick's work after that. And Nick is not only a versatile artist, he's an international artist. And, I really put him on the same sort of kind of global footing as everybody from a kind of Robert Hughes to Germaine Greer to Barry, I'm having a mental block, Dame Edna Everidge, like all these sort of iconic figures. Clive James, obviously Les Murray here at home who's kind of a different figure because he stayed home. Patrick White, who I've just mentioned, Brett Whiteley, these people that are so iconic and so big, even if you don't actually like them and like their work, and certainly Nick in particular is a polarising artist, they're so much a part of our history and how they've moved and grown and become successful. And in Nick's case, how he's done all those things is relevant to our wider culture and to our history and to sort of just being Australian in a contemporary context. So I think that's where the interest lies. It's not just about Nick, it's about us.
Absolutely. You say that toward the end of the book. You write that these kinds of works are like a kind of almost like a social biography project. Mm-hmm. And I felt that acutely reading it. When you talk about you had to focus it down because there's his output's extraordinary, the depth of his work is extraordinary. Is there a lot else written about these early years of Nick Cave's life? I mean, is that something you felt you really could bring to that kind of Nick Cave canon, if we can call it that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like basically, once Nick left Australia with the Boys Next Door and they turned into the Birthday Party in the UK, and then the Birthday Party sort of dissolves and Nick establishes the Bad Seeds primarily in Berlin and then across the rest of the world after that. That's a very mapped area, particularly through a lot of great interviews and articles. And Nick was always a larger than life figure, so he attracted a lot of attention. But the Australian part of Nick's identity has not been so well mapped, and it's much rarer, but it's key to Nick. Like a song like Red Right Hand, which I say in the book, that's like a map of Wangaratta. When you go there, you can find your way around town using Red Right Hand as your Google Maps if you wanted to treat it that way. But it's also like a mythical shadow of his own childhood. And if you watch Autoluminescent, the documentary, or not Autoluminescent, the 20,000, I think it is, where Nick does a song called Give Us a Kiss, that echoes the words of Red Right Hand. And again, it's a map of Wangaratta, and that's more of a love song. So he's pulled back to that sort of youthful landscape as a forming and dreaming part of who he is. So I was pulled there as well by the music as much as anything else. And I think when I look at the book now, I see how significant all that is. And I realise how lucky I was, because Nick allowed me to speak with his mother, who no one had ever spoken to before, to other members of his family. I went to Wangaratta. I spoke to old school teachers, old school friends that he'd grown up with. I did a lot of footwork like that I think is really important to who Nick is. And I think it's really important, again, not to get too repetitive about it, but to who we are, because it's about growing up in Australia.
I'm going to come to that in a bit, but I just wanted to ask some kind of big Nick Cave questions, if I can. We know it from the Red Right Hand files, from the documentaries that he's done. There's the man and there's the myth. Mm-hmm. And what you describe beautifully in your book is that he's always had a hand in creating that myth. He's always had some level of control, or he's always been cognizant of that. And I wondered, it's a big question, but what did you come to understand about the quote unquote, the real Nick Cave? The difference between the real Nick Cave and the mythical Nick Cave. Did you have a lot of moments where he sort of he would set that mythical man aside when you were talking to him?
Oh yeah, of course. I was really fortunate that the book took place over a long period of time. I had many conversations with Nick, and it begins to feel like you're in more of a kind of working kind of process or engagement. And so you sort of forget that sort of fame stuff and those kind of things. And I mean, they're important to the writing, but they're less important, or perhaps an obstruction to the relationship, So you're trying to get beyond that. I don't know, the myth of Nick and his identity, a lot of that, it kind of really comes out of the birthday party and the early bad seeds and that whole kind of Prince of Darkness, Hamlet of rock and roll, heroin demon, all these things. I mean, there's kind of been a reformation now since, Nick got straight, got married, became a father to 2 sons second time around. He's got 2 older sons as well. So he changed very much at the turn of the century through his marriage with Susie Bick, through becoming a father to Arthur and Earl, with Arthur obviously sadly dying more recently. And I think there was a different type of evolution. And I feel that in myself. I know being a father, how that changes you, and it doesn't necessarily soften you, it can intensify you, but you get a different kind of intensity out of it. So in some ways, I think, if you want to talk about the myth of Nick Cave, I think that shadow thing clings to him, but the reality is someone who's a lot more decent and kind, and that's become more manifest in more recent times through things like the Red Hand files. And in my eyes, someone who was a very good, attentive, caring father.
You say early on that this biography is kind of Nick Cave's creation story, looking at who he was when he was a young man. And you say as well in the book that from really early on, you tried to avoid entrenched positions and all the rewriting of history to fit a new point of view. What were you thinking about specifically when you mentioned that in the book?
Well, I mean, I do think there is an element of Nick reframing his life. And like all of us, you tend to leave out certain things and, emphasize certain stories. So I was interested to get other people's perspectives, whether it was perspectives on growing up in Wangaratta. So I spoke to Nick's first great love, Anne Baumgarten. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot by saying that, but when I say first great love, they were kids. And a really good friend of his, Brian Washington, who sadly died, who called himself Nick's first boy next door. And, then of course you've got the whole Crystal Ballroom scene as well, and the conflicts that are there. So you're building a constellation of impressions, and those impressions are as much about the people as they are about Nick, I guess. And you're getting hold of a world and the person in it rather than just the person.
Let's come back to Wangaratta. Let's come to that early part of his life. You detail really beautifully, and from interviews with him, that landscape exists in almost all of his work. He discovered that later in life. Can you talk a bit about that, like what that landscape was and why it shaped him in the way that it has?
Well, Wangaratta's classic, it's Ned Kelly country for a start, which I found really fascinating. And it's Ned Kelly country literally and historically, but it's Ned Kelly country in terms of the paintings of Sidney Nolan. It's a landscape that historically and mythically Nick's father, Colin Cave, was very fascinated by. And Colin Cave was something of an amateur historian and wrote about Ned Kelly and created a symposium in Wangaratta that Manning Clark, the great Australian historian, went to, and that I think Ian Jones attended, but certainly read material from, that formed his basically definitive portrait of who Ned Kelly is. So the Cave family and the Ned Kelly myth are deeply interwoven, and Nick grew up with that in a very kind of sort of passionate way. And I mean, you can see that in a song like Dead Joe is a reference to, I think, Joe Boyd, who was strung up outside of Glenrowan, and that really graphic sort of photograph, which Nick actually refers to again in the proposition. They use it as one of the opening stills. So there's all these shadows and echoes and allusions that are coming out of the Wangaratta landscape. As I said, Red Right Hand being a kind of a literal map and a kind of love map and a fear map as well, depending on the emotions that Nick's kind of tapping into. I don't know, I think all of us understand that, particularly as we get older, we go back to our childhood and we go back to our teenage years to sort of figure out what we are and to refigure who we are. So it's a source point, it's a kind of kind of, there might be trauma there as well, of course, but it's also a kind of creative nourishment for us. And, you know, the nearer, I guess it's a bit of a cliche, but the nearer we get to death ourselves and growing older, the more those formative times mean to us. Yeah. I don't know if I'm answering your question there or just rambling off onto a tangent.
No, I think that's a very good way of describing it. There is something, I guess, as well, you know, you detail it beautifully in the book, something very sort of quintessentially Australian about Nick Cave. I noticed that when I've been to a couple of his gigs, when he comes back to Australia, and he just has this way of engaging with Australian audiences that only an Australian artist can.
Yeah.
A lot of his life living away, but could you talk a bit about that aspect? Because I think it's something that sets him apart as a performer, as a writer, as a thinker, as a creator.
Well, I mean, that emerged really strongly to me out of all the material in Boy on Fire. And that was definitely on my agenda for it to be a portrait of an Australian artist. And it matters to Nick a lot that he's recognised as an Australian artist. And I think in some ways, which goes back to your question about mythology, I think there are elements where he's almost felt that the mythologising has gotten in the road of the recognition of how Australian he truly is. And in the book he talks about "And the Ass or the Angel," which is written in a very sort of Southern American Gothic style, and semi-regrets that perhaps he should have just said it more purely in Wangaratta, because it is a kind of highly exaggerated, hyper-intensified story set in that town, and he's just transposed it to the southern part of America and into the language of Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner. But really, it's much more intimate than that. So that's perhaps a case of where the mythology has muddied or hidden the man or been a place to hide in, consciously so, I think, in his 20s and maybe with some regrets now. And I feel there's this arc back to being Australian and to those Australian resources in Nick, and to, again, finding kind of sustenance in that. And the other thing, which I really think is important, is that the book at different times, I think, is really funny. And it's funny because of how Nick talks and how other members of the Boys Next Door and other people talk, but particularly Roland S. Howard and Phil Calvert and Tracy Pugh and Mick Harvey. They're all, their comments have a certain Australian dryness. And as Australians, we hear the humour. That's funny. So you read a comment, and if you were to take it literally, you could just take it as a kind of blank slate kind of detail. But of course, it's comedy, and it's Australian comedy. And that's one of the things I'm really proud of in the book, that you can actually hear the Australian quality in how Nick and the people around him speak. And I can see how that would have kind of bamboozled the English and the Europeans, and they would have realised that they're actually being funny, you know. And yeah, I'm proud of that.
That was a bit of a surprise to me, how funny he is. You know, people throughout that you interviewed in the book said he's got the funny bone, and I wouldn't have known it had I not read the book, or if I'd not heard him speak on stage, where he's very funny, he's very dry, and, you know, moves so quickly between weird ideas, but in a very comical way. You know, we think of him as this kind of serious Prince of Darkness. Just staying with this idea of where he belongs. You know, there's interesting stuff in the book about whether being in Wangaratta, or Wang, as everyone who's there called it, but whether living in Wang is what formed Nick, or whether it was having to leave Wang because his parents sent him away to go to boarding school in Melbourne, where he didn't know anyone. He sort of had to start all over again. And there's the theme that comes up quite a lot in the book is whether he's like a driven man or a fleeing man, you know, whether he's kind of going to something or running from something. What do you think? Is Wangaratta still a place of solace and of creation for him? Or was it about leaving Wangaratta that sort of shaped him?
I mean, really, it's all those things, you know, all those sort of polarities sort of playing off one another. I don't know if Wangaratta itself is a place of solace for Nick, but the idea of it possibly is at times for him. I mean, there are lots of negative things he felt and has said about Wangaratta as well, but I think the overriding feeling is one of love, and you sense in the way he talks about it that it's a kind of magical place, and it's really a place in memory as much as an actuality. And now I think, you know, like when you listen to an incredible record like Ghosteen, he's gone into this sort of more internal landscape. So the landscape is within him. And there are fragments of physicality and a sense of a street in the rain, whatever it might be in Ghosteen, but you're really inhabiting his internal world and a sort of sense of elemental darkness as well when it comes to his concern for things like the environment that you can also sense, you know. So there's an edge there. It's a different type of landscape, and maybe his love of poetry has advanced that in the work he's doing with Warren Ellis in terms of those ambient synthesized soundtracks and loops and tape foundations have enhanced that sense of being in the consciousness of Nick, rather than being in a kind of mythical place. And I mean, you can almost separate the partnerships between Mick Harvey and Warren Ellis, the creative collaborations Nick has, in terms of with Mick Harvey, Nick was very much, had a sense of mythical places and mythical characterizations. And then with Warren Ellis, he's moved into this more sort of amorphous and kind of starry and yet also sinister place that is much more kind of within his being. So, but always there's a sense of them taking place, happening, if not in a place, in a space somewhere, you know.
At the start of the bio, you detail, you know, he's come back to Australia to be inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame, and there are all these people in Melbourne who are his friends who are kind of, you know, they're deriding him, they're kind of mocking him, and you feel for Nick a lot. And then early in the book as well, you take us to Wangaratta and you've met all these wonderful people who are his first friends, his first girlfriends, you know, the people who live next door to him. But as the book goes on, you get this sense that friendship has always been kind of a conflicted thing for Nick Cave. There are these descriptions all the way through about how he kind of uses people up. And I wonder if, you know, having talked to Nick now, I know you first met him in 85 and you've talked to lots of other people, what your view on that is, about whether that is kind of a true hallmark of him and what that was about, his way of being with friends. Because sometimes it was competitive, sometimes it was, you know, he just kind of dumped people.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think any driven artist will, to some extent, use everything around them as a resource, right? So, and that can be problematic for people. It can be painful. It can also be thrilling. I mean, you know, the number of artists who have partners who are disappointed that they're not producing public love poetry for them, I'm sure, is marked, you know. So people want the attention, but then they get the attention and the attention's not quite what they expected, yeah? So because the artist is both using people and exaggerating them and inventing another reality within the demands of the work itself. I also think with Nick too, there is an element for sure that he works with people, then he moves on. And I mean, that's fair enough. If you had tight friendships with someone you worked at McDonald's with when you were 17 for 2 years, you're not going to stay in contact with them for the rest of your lives. The difference being, of course, Nick has just got more and more and more famous. So there is a tendency at times for people, I think, to feel a bit left behind or forgotten in terms of the relationships, you know. And I was aware of that even in the connections I was making with Nick through the biography, and not wanting to become like some sort of mollusk trying to attach myself to him, which you see because of the celebrity, and also because Nick is a very charming and intelligent and talented person. So he's someone that you like, and you like the communication, but he has a bigger vision and he has a place to go, and he's on a journey. And for whatever part of the journey that you share with him, I think mostly you can count yourself lucky. It becomes problematic when the creativity is sort of hoovered up in the collaboration. Like, you know, Roland S. Howard is a classic case of that. Nick sang Roland's song Shivers. Shivers became Nick's song. A lot of people forget that Roland S. Howard wrote that song. So there's and Nick himself says he regrets taking the song from Roland and singing the song, but I don't know how much Nick really regrets that. And I'm not sure that the song would be the song we know today if Nick hadn't done that.
Yeah.
And so there's, you know, there's all these sort of difficult pluses and minuses within it, and you can sort of feel that sort of absorbing of other people constantly. I almost think that's Nick's great talent, but it does bother some people. His willingness to take from anything, anywhere, and anybody, and you can't copyright an idea. So there is a sense that Nick is sort of, you know, eating up the world and putting it out. But I also think he's generous. You know, he was obviously had a very important collaborative relationship with Mick Harvey, a very important one now with Warren Ellis, and the recognition that Roland S. Howard deservedly is getting now in a kind of renaissance does in part come from the relationship he had with Nick. So there's all, I don't know, it's just this sort of funny sort of river with all these currents moving within it, and there's good and bad within that, and that's that really.
There's a theme that runs through a lot of the interviews in the book, you know, from the Melbourne film director Paul Goldman to lots of people who've worked with Nick throughout his life, that they'd never seen anyone, as you say, absorb everything. They, you know, that Nick Cave was someone who would take everything and anything, and he would just, you know, suck it up. But I wondered if, when you were just talking then, that maybe his gift is that it doesn't come out sounding like someone else's stuff. It somehow comes out as an expression of Nick Cave.
Mind you, some of his references can be pretty direct lifts, you know. You know, it's that T.S. Eliot thing of the artist. I mean, I forget the precise quote from Eliot's sort of critical essay, but basically the artist is thief. And there's a lot of conversation around that at the moment, and people getting kind of slaughtered for plagiarism. And when you look into it, it's really this thing of how the work is absorbed and reused. And I also think musicians in particular are much more inclined to that so-called plagiaristic inclination, whether you're looking at hip-hop artists and sampling, or whether you're looking at the construction of blues and folk that are to some extent communal forms. And then individual artists take something that's been there and existing and used by 100 people, and they make it their own in the moment that they own it. And, you know, maybe a song like Stagger Lee that Nick does is a really great example of that, because that is actually an old song, and there are hundreds of versions of it, but Nick makes it his, you know. And so I think musicians are much more freewheeling and liberal about that concept, but they're also more liberated in terms of how they use their influences and take them in.
I think, as you said a few times earlier in our conversation, you know, that to some extent this biography is about all of us. It's about how we influence the things we not consume, how we influence the things that we enjoy, you know, that we're part of that process. And there's a great David Mitchell book from this year called Utopia Avenue about sort of a pretend rock and roll band who were huge in the 70s. And there's a great quote about that ideas and songs, you know, they spring into the mind of people, but they come from the people who are around those people, like a kind of a collective creativity almost. And you detail that really beautifully in this book, that Nick's got a great gift for sort of tapping into that.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like I need to say too, like we look now at everything through the prism of Nick because he's become so famous and so significant. But when the Boys Next Door were formed, obviously Nick was a real star already, but they were a real unit. They were a very talented group of people. Mick Harvey, Nick would have a creative partnership with him for 30 plus years, you know, like Roland S. Howard would have a damaged and yet fascinating and brilliant career all his own. Phil Calvert is an incredible drummer and is still working behind the scenes with an independent record company, sort of cultivating young artists. And he played with Psychedelic Furs as well after the Birthday Party. Tracy Pugh, who was the bass player for the Boys Next Door on the Birthday Party, he virtually, along with Chris Walsh, his best friend who taught him bass, between the two of them, defined what we understand as that sort of Melbourne swampy, doomy kind of dark sound that was Tracy Pugh, and that became a signature sound for decades and still is a signature sound. So each of those individuals were very, very kind of powerful and important people. But you're right, in the end, it all kind of led to Nick's sort of stardom, but Nick kept moving too. This is the thing, Nick always moves. I think, if anything, that's the interesting thing about him. He's pressing forward all the time.
And as you say, you know, he started life as a band member and not always as a confident singer and musician. That kind of it's always been something he's grappled with throughout his career. I found that really painful to read every time, that in all those choirs he joined where he'd open his mouth to sing and people would just tell him to be quiet, and that never really left him.
Yeah, poor guy.
He's gone from being poor guy.
I think he's a bit more comfortable about it now, but you know, for sure he suffered in those younger years.
Yeah. You know, he's been a musician and then a performer, and now he's an entertainer. Is he comfortable with that evolution?
Well, I think he's very comfortable. You know, I think he's a consummate professional now. But that is a kind of a sort of a defence as well, like the aggression that was the primary mask of his youth, and the sort of the professionalism, and I guess the sort of almost sort of Buddhist sort of compassion that he exudes through the Red Hand Files now. All of that is real, but it is also a kind of, I think, a defence as well. Or it is this strange relationship between what we build in public, which is a kind of mask, and who we are behind the mask, and how the mask, we become the mask, we become the performance. And I guess I would think that, you know, looking at Nick's full trajectory, that he has sort of begun to perform a sort of kindness and compassion that can lead him into the light and into some sort of kind of reconciled space in terms of the sort of grieving and the intense pain he's obviously been through since the loss of his son, and just into being a better and more interesting artist. And I think in the same way, when he was younger, the map you can see in my book is this really sweet, very talented and rebellious country boy moving into a pretty dark and intense space. And there's a kind of nuclear explosion primed and ready to occur out of that move into the darkness and all the reasons behind it and all the influences that are packing into it. So it's all packing together, and it's going to get denser, you know, if you moved on to the London phase with the birthday party and explode.
You mentioned before that, you know, he had this real antagonism, this almost kind of violent way of managing how he was on stage. If that was the expression of how he was when he was with the Boys Next Door. And one of the hallmarks now, as you say, of this extraordinarily consummate professional performer is his incredible relationship with audiences now. You know, I've seen him a few times, and my description of him, he's almost like a kind of a shaman vampire. You know, he kind of gives and leads, but he also sucks all the energy that the audience give him as well. It's a strange interchange to watch. But I wondered, you know, as you say in the book, his relationship to audiences has really changed. In those early days that you detail, there's real disgust. I think one of the lines he yelled at a crowd was, "Do you hate us as much as we hate you?" And now there's this kind of appreciation. And I wondered if you could talk about that chart for him, that evolution.
Well, I mean, I think when you talk about that disgust thing, it's more of a feature of the birthday party days. I think the Boys Next Door were entertaining and fun. They were young. They were full of that kind of youthful energy. They had more humour. But when you look at them on YouTube, there's a sort of a wired, sharp quality to them that's got it. There's an edge there, and the edge just seems to get sharper and harder as they go on and they become more experimental and get sort of wild, and drugs come into the picture basically. And I think Nick is his artistic vision begins to really sort of expand, and he's looking for places to exercise I guess those sort of demons and energies. But I wouldn't want to characterize the Boys Next Door as in this. They're different to the birthday party, and yet obviously both entities come together. The birthday party is the real dark storm. But even then, the humour's still there that we talked about earlier. They're weirdly, it's weirdly confrontational yet also funny. It's such a, it's kind of almost a strange mix, really. I look back at it myself because I saw a very early birthday party just when the Boys Next Door had first changed their name to them, and they were still kind of shifting their identity, and they were kind of a strange band, really. I guess they were trying to figure out themselves what they were. And, you know, as I map in the book too, sometimes it feels like years are passing. You realise it's just months. They're moving from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and the way they eat the influences and then spit them out again, whether it's the confrontational stuff or this kind of offbeat, Dadaist kind of humour that's coming through more sort of art-oriented influences, or it's just, I mean, you know, there's this incredible compendium of stuff, you know. It's pretty amazing, really. I'm impressed. Yeah.
Extraordinary. You detailed beautifully a lot of the songwriting kind of evolution that Nick's gone through, you know, the people he wrote with, the people who influenced him, from poets and sociologists to academics to lots of painters, lots of art that seemed to really feed into Nick's way of feeling music and writing music. But you say toward the end of the book that he was discovering a form he could write in where all was revealed and everything was still secret, which I loved. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about the characters that he's created in his songs and what he said to you about what they've allowed him to kind of explore both in his music and in his own kind of life.
Well, in relation to the art conversation, you know, he went to art school and failed, and I think that was, I mean, Nick made light of it, but for sure it wounded him at the time. And I think really he wanted to be Brett Whiteley, really. You know, Brett Whiteley was a hero of his, and that was a big disappointment. And he kind of slid sideways into music, which was happening at the same time, out of that, and then realised himself more fully within it as time marched on and the band got better and better. So far as the characters he creates, you know, obviously Nick was always a very literary person. His father was a, you know, highly intelligent literary sort of figure as well, a teacher, English teacher, also a theatre director. His mother was a librarian, so he's saturated in that kind of literary consciousness. I think particularly with his father and that Colin Cave, his father's background as a theatre director, you see how Nick got interested in performing and creating characters he could perform through, even himself as a character on stage and that kind of performing thing. And I think he began to see how he could admit all these other forces that could be difficult to do in a straight up first person approach, and use characters to express both the best and the worst of himself. And he continued to develop that and do that for a very long time. Maybe with the Boys Next Door, for early on period, when you listen to Door Door, that's much more kind of autobiographical and even sort of weirdly sociological in a kind of comic kind of way. And then as they move into sort of Hee Haw, it gets more Dada-ish and absurdist, and you're feeling like you're beginning to move onto an actual stage of some sort where characters are being born. And then by the time of the birthday party, you've got King Ink, Hamlet, Pow, 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 and you get into that territory where the characters are more like out of Kafka novels, out of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and he's using them and creating them in a more kind of poisoned kind of rock and roll context to basically talk about his own stuff, and it's the same way Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver can channel a kind of disturbed, psychopathic, masculine energy, and through the directing power of Martin Scorsese, that combination somehow it allows us to sort of get a vision of a really sort of dark and troubling place. I mean, Nick, with his collaboration with Mick Harvey, was able to kind of explore those kind of territories. So the violence that was taking place, it was never really meant to occur in an actual real world way. It was a landscape within art where one explored the shadows and the darkness, and to some extent, you know, without kind of being even too polite about it, managed to sort of exorcise or release it, or at least look at it. You know, now we seem to be frightened to do that looking, and we want kind of our art to be more homogenized and less volatile, and really, I think, less challenging. But I think, you know, Nick, particularly at that sort of phase and those kind of characters he created, and I think he took his lessons from writers like Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner and Cormac McCarthy and others. He found that the subjects that he could make, the characters he could create, and actually folk and blues as well, which are full of dark sort of demonic figures, the sort of shadow consciousness of what we are deep down in the sort of stew of our psychic identity. Nick kind of make these figures and go places, and that's what we want from art. We want to kind of go into the shadowlands and return released and better informed about how to deal with this other stuff. But yeah, I think at the moment there's a sense that we want to keep things in the white zone and in the pure light zone. And unfortunately, I think what that means is we're hiding from the shadows and we're not really facing them.
Just as a digressive point, that's a really interesting idea that you raise. When do you think we started hiding from the shadowlands? How long have we been retreating from them?
Well, I think I mean, you know, it's probably getting off the subject a bit, but I think this is kind of relates to issues with Nick's been, you know, outspoken about around cancel culture. I think there's a real nervousness around volatile, difficult material, and it's
Try away from it.
Yeah, so it's easier not to go there, and I just think, well, art is the place where we most need to have these explorations occur. You know, that is the kind of horror playground of the subconscious through which we face a whole lot of things that are otherwise not dealt with.
In a moment, I'm going to throw open to our audience to ask questions. If they've got questions now, it'd be great to put them in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can in a moment. But on the back of what you just said, Mark, talking about the way that Nick's, you know, literary influences kind of allowed him to explore darkness, you know, the darkness in paintings like by people like Egon Schiele, or in poetry that was, you know, violent, and his great ability to zone in on that violent moment and kind of explore it. You have this beautiful way of describing it in the book where early on you talk about how he became very good at learning to live with the dead. You know, when we talk about Nick Cave as a kind of a figure, we can't help but, if we know anything about him, to think about the death of his father when Nick was 19. And then
21.
Sorry, a young man. But then more recently, the death of his, as you said, his son Arthur, one of his twins. And someone you interview in the books, I can't remember who, said, you know, Nick's got 9 lives. Wherever he was, he always landed on his feet. You know, everyone else was getting sick when they were doing drugs in Melbourne or overdosing, and he never did. And I wonder, now that you've spent all this time with him, both before and after his son's terrible death, for those who've died, like, does Nick Cave keep them very present? Is their absence very much a part of his life? How does it shape him now?
Gee, I'm not sure how to answer that. I think you just are touched by these moments that both hurt you, but they offer you a kind of liberation as well, and it's a really hard thing to stay true to. But if you make your art as well as you can make it, you can kind of honour people or pain or grief, as the case may be, if we're talking about Nick in more recent years. You know, like, to my mind, Ghostine is just absolutely a masterpiece, magnificent work. You know, a great, you know, any great classical composer would be, or poet would be pleased to have done it. You know, so he has sort of not just honoured the loss of his son and honoured his son. He's made something that other people can sort of feel through, and yeah, you know, like he's kind of if it wasn't as good as it was, then it would be different. So it's a kind of reconciliation with these losses, and you're sort of also, in a sense, you're almost not keeping people alive, but some way of they're breathing within you through a song or a poem, as the case may be, and I think artists know this with a beautiful painting or a piece of music or a poem, that they still hold some part of the person, some energy there, and it's a sort of gift, you know.
I've got a couple of questions I'm going to go to, and then I've got some more to come back to. Question here: did you learn much about yourself working on this project? Or what did you learn about yourself working on this project?
Oh man, yeah. I basically had a kind of heart breakdown trying to do the thing, you know, initially. So that's why the book took so long. I was kind of hammering at it really hard for about 5 years, and then came totally unstuck because I was trying to do a complete life of Nick, and there was just too much there. And I couldn't do it. I just could not do it. And I wanted back at that stage to do a portrait of the artist as a young man, but I was told that there wasn't enough interest in that. And then everything just kind of fell to pieces, including me. And it's kind of took me almost as long to rebuild myself and return to the subject and return to the idea that I wanted to do as a solution to my problem, and find myself vindicated in where I wanted to go. And with that too, I have to say that when I was in Wangaratta, I sat in a park under a tree that Nick used to climb as a young boy, and I recognised the landscape. It's very similar to the landscape I grew up in as a boy in Newcastle. A pool, swimming pool nearby, semi-industrial landscape not far away, a suburb just on the sort of edge of sort of town. All these kind of qualities that I think as Australians we would all know. And sitting under that tree, just feeling the wind in it and the heat, and I thought, wow, I know this place. I have lived here. Of course I hadn't, but I've lived here in its feeling, and I can do this book. And I guess maybe I focused on the childhood and the teenage years to come back to some sort of point of strength within myself and some understanding. Because there is that quote which I mentioned, the Da Vinci quote, the portrait painter always paints himself. So any biographer is of course creating a kind of projected story. So my story about Nick is literally my story about Nick, and I'm sure there'll be many others, many others, and they'll be different. Mine's only a version.
Someone asked the question that I wanted to ask, which often feels like a cruel question, especially to ask of a writer, when you just said that the book was, you know, took so much out of you to write. But do you think there might ever be a volume 2? Suzanne's asked us.
All right, now I've had that question a few times. Well, I've got the material for a volume 2. I've got enough easily to write about London, Berlin and Sao Paulo. But wow, you know, like the thought of doing it kind of half terrifies me. At the same time, I feel obligation to all the people I spoke to, and not just to the speaking to them, but to their stories, because, you know, people are trusting you. They're giving you, each person is giving you a part of themselves. That's the strange, precious obligation of doing a biography. It's not just the subject, it's everyone around them. And so you're kind of carrying a sort of social history with them, and a remembering that it runs quite deep. So yeah, I'm kind of, yeah, maybe, you know, like ask me next year. You know, I've got a novel that I want to put out as well that I've had on the back burner because of this project, and I'd like to do a collected journalism. So if I could get those two things sorted out, then I'd probably feel fresher to return to Nick again, you know, which might horrify. We'll see.
And another sort of biographer craft question, if we can stay on that topic, you know, you describe in the beginning of the book that you'd met Nick in 1985, you'd been working on this project for a while, and then in 2015 his son died in tragic circumstances, and then after that he said that was a before and after. He said, you know, and everything I said before is kind of irrelevant. How did you take that on board and then finish the project? Because that would seem like an enormous, like just like falling off a cliff. You know, you've come to this point, suddenly the person you're interviewing, your subject says everything I said before just doesn't hold anymore because my life has changed.
Well, yeah, that's only what Nick says. And I always knew the book was about more than Nick. And that's what Nick was saying at that point in time. And I had a bigger vision in mind than just a portrait of Nick. And Nick had not seen the full content of the book by then. So I don't know that he would have been able to fully understand what I was doing. And his position on that has softened to some extent since then in the limited communication that we've had. So, and in the end, I didn't agree. I had different obligations and different goals. And I mean, I've said this before because of how people both either revere Nick or hate Nick. It's kind of like this, both of which are like sides of the same coin to my mind. But I was never Nick's servant, but I was never his assassin either. I was wanting to do something more complex and bigger than just a single focus portrait, adoration, whatever about him. It was about this. It was really about the worlds. It's about Wangaratta. It's about Melbourne in the 70s. It's about Australian culture. It's about how an artist is born. So there are all these other aspects to it. So I just had to say, okay, I know that's what you think, but I think otherwise.
When you were thinking about those all the interviews you did in Wangaratta, who were some of the biggest influences on him in terms of that fed into some of his early kind of musical and writing choices? Because later in the book we start talking about, as we said, people he met at art school or painters that he started to whose work he loved. But who were some of the early musical influences on him that he met in Wangaratta?
All right. Well, Nick's talked a lot about Johnny Cash and watching the Johnny Cash show, listening to Leonard Cohen with Anne Baumgarten and songs of love and hate, and so they were both big for Nick. Jimi Hendrix, which I was really interested in, that he loved Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon, Plastic Ono band sort of period. So all very, and the beginnings of it actually kind of happened as much in Melbourne, but his real worship of David Bowie as well. I love the sequence where he talked about he'd get home from school and put David Bowie live on and get a comb or something and be singing to it, pretending he was singing to all these people, which which all of us have done, like that's so that, but all those artists are really, I think you can still see they stayed with Nick his whole life. They stayed with him his whole life, and just
there's a great line, I think, where he talks about how Leonard Cohen could feel a note, could imbue one note with such extraordinary sound, and I think that Nick Cave does that as well.
For him, I would like to ended up singing with Johnny Cash. I mean he says so, but what a buzz, to be with someone so iconic and so important, and to have got yourself to a place where they're singing a song of yours, The Mercy Seat, and where you're singing with them as well on another track, and just to be in their company, just to be in their company, and they have given you so much, and you're able to give a little back. In the case of Johnny Cash, when he's at death's door and his talent is still on its last glow, and to be able to kind of basically literally hold his hand and lead him into the studio and perform with him must have been really special.
There are a couple more questions that have come through now, which is great. Someone said, did Dawn get to read any of the book? Nick's mom?
No, I would love Dawn to read it, although I would have been quite nervous as well. I got to to know Nick's mother, Dawn Cave, extremely well. She was a beautiful woman, really friendly, very, very intelligent, very humorous. When I'd go down to Melbourne to do interviews with people, I'd often land at her place and just stay a couple of hours, and she'd make me tea and sandwiches and biscuits. You know, it's like having a second mum or something. She was just, I loved going around to visit her. And you know, I've said this before, but you do that stupid thing with people who are older where you treat them as if they're not alive, fully intelligent people. But Dawn was quite able to instantly engage in a conversation on T.S. Eliot or the poetry of Yeats or W.H. Auden. And she had a very kind of witty, although absolutely loving view of Nick. And yeah, she was just, I would have been nervous for her to see some of it because there are edges in the book that I know Nick, there's stuff in the book that Nick won't like. And obviously Dawn is Nick's was Nick's mother. So her loyalty to him would be such that I probably would, I may have caused some disapproval, and that would bother me. It would bother me, you know, because I really liked her a lot.
Has Nick talked to you about having read the book? Has he given you any feedback? Has he read it?
I don't know. I sent a copy to him in the UK. I imagine someone will ask eventually. He might not say anything. I think it would be a bit of a weird thing to read a book about yourself and
Sure.
how someone sees you. So I just think he'd have to have mixed feelings about it, even if everything I wrote was completely loving, which it's not.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, I guess I just hope, you know, I think you asked the question before about the writing, that even if he has mixed feelings about the content, that he would respect the quality of the writing, and he would sort of understand it from that point of view as an artist, and that he would see I tried to do the best I could to be both honest and a good storyteller, because obviously I've got to entertain people and keep them enchanted and involved in the information. And he would understand all those things, you know. But yeah, it's a bit of a weird thing to sort of hold up a kind of bent mirror to someone and say, "What do you reckon?"
Although speaking of bent mirrors, there's a great story in the book that I won't ruin for people from Paul Goldman when they were filming the Shivers film clip, which was a great story about Nick and Mirror. I'll let people enjoy. There's people just want to add to your workload, Mark. There's another question here. Someone says, given that Nick Cave's an international, you know, he's got international significance, is there scope for a biopic based on your book?
Actually, I've had a couple of people begin to approach me about that, just very tentatively. I always actually felt the book was very kind of cinematic, obviously not all of it, but, you know, like I write in a way where I'm seeing it happening. And Nick talks about this thing too. He can't write a song. He says, I can't write a song I can't see. And I must admit, I'm very similar to that. Like I need to be seeing it and kind of feeling it and sort of visualizing it too. So the feeling's really important to it as well. So I always imagined it kind of having that quality. Like the Wangaratta chapter to me could be like a kind of rock and roll year my voice broke, and the Crystal Ballroom thing for me had almost that Tarkovsky dream-like quality to it, because drugs start to come into it. So so cinema for sure was an influence on the kind of mindset that I was trying to get to in the writing, and naturally enough, therefore, I think that the book lends itself to those sort of possibilities. And it's a great story, independent of it being my biography, the actual nature of that period and those experiences of growing up in a country town and the Crystal Ballroom, post-punk music, art, fashion, drug scene. They are really incredible narratives.
And as you say, the characters as well, you know, I think you said earlier in the book that if our friends are a measure of who we are as people, and Nick's done pretty well, because the caliber of sensitive, creative, intelligent, strange, you know, memorable people who feature all throughout his life. Even as a young child, he had this great ability to draw people to him and draw a lot out of people. There's another question here just before we finish, which is "Boy on Fire" is a, you know, it's a great title. Is it a quote from somewhere?
Well, I mean, I thought of it, but there's a lot of allusions to fire in Nick's work, you know, whether it's a track which I mentioned in the book, like Sunny's Burning, I'm on Fire, Fireboy, which is like a B-side that's kind of about Nick's older brother. So it was pretty easy to kind of sort of click into that, and it was just one of those off the top of the head things that just kind of dropped into my mind, and then I thought, oh, that's, you know, and it's got a truth to it, like he's sort of glowing and then he's burning, you know, and and maybe that's the arc of the book too, something that has a kind of beauty to it and something, a fierceness.
Well, Mark Mordue, I hope the book goes far and wide. Thank you so much for all your ideas and sharing your stories with us this evening. I'm sure I have to say, I wish we could all see each other so we could all do a round of applause on everyone's little faces there. I wanted to say to everyone watching tonight, thanks very much. Be sure to get the book if you haven't already. It's a sublime read. And also be sure to keep your eye on the Better Read Than Dead. Yep, Bronwyn's holding up the book now.
Well, I should do the same.
We've still got some signed copies as well.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Thank you.
Just wanted to say that there are more events coming up at Better Read Than Dead. You can keep your eye on their website or their Facebook page. But for now, thanks so much, Mark Mordue, and good evening, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. See you later.